Well, good evening, everybody. Welcome to the Fletcher School of Law and Diplomacy here at Tufts University. And I'm thrilled to see a very robust turnout for an extraordinary, an important, and a vibrant European leader. President Toomas Ilves of Estonia is someone who I have come to know over the last 4 years as the NATO commander. I had the opportunity to visit Tallinn many times in those years. I've spent a great deal of time with the senior leadership of this brave, historic nation. And throughout my 4 years, I was privileged to come to know the president and spend time with him in a variety of situations. He is someone who has spent a great deal of time here in the United States. So in that sense, we welcome him back to these shores. He actually spent a fair amount of time as a young man in New Jersey. So you will detect that immediately, and if you're expecting a European accent, you'll definitely hear Bruce Springsteen when he starts to talk. He's also, to use a single word, brilliant. And I'll give you a practical example of that. He is world-renowned as an expert on cyber, as well as a leader who has moved his economy so that it has actually grown over the last series of years, when in Europe there had been a great number of nations who have not enjoyed any growth. So you would think of him as a cyber, as business, as international relations. He studied psychology as an undergraduate here in the United States, in Columbia and at Penn. All those things you pick up from his biography. So yesterday I took the president over to meet with our president here at Tufts University, President Tony Monaco. Now, if you know President Monaco of Tufts, you're aware that President Monaco is one of the globe's experts on the human genome, on synthetic biology, and a wide variety of topics in the biologic sciences. When the ambassador to the United States from Estonia, also a Fletcher grad, who's with us today, she and I sat down with the two presidents. And I thought the conversation would quickly turn to cyber and economics and international relations, the things that I know a few things about. Unfortunately for me, the conversation immediately turned into human genome, synthetic biology, and there was only one person in that room who was going to keep up with Tony Monaco, and it was the president of Estonia. They had an extremely sophisticated discussion about it. So I offer this as evidence that we tonight will deal with a Renaissance mind, one that is capable of understanding a wide variety of fact, of psychology, of idea, and indeed is one of the leading heads of government and state in a nation that is an ally in NATO, an ally to the United States, and a global leader in the world of cyber. Please join me in a round of applause for the President of Estonia. Mr. President. Hi.
Well, thank you, Admiral, for your very kind words, and it really is an honor for me to be here at this remarkable university, which, of course, because the ambassador is an alumna, we're especially proud. And I should say, on my part, we're extremely lucky that Admiral Stavridis spent 4 years as Supreme Allied Commander of Europe, that is the operational military commander of NATO. Without your leadership, our life, I can tell you straight from the horse's mouth, our security situation would have been much, much, much worse than it is today. And so certainly the qualities that make anyone a 4-star general or admiral in the United States requires quite an exceptional person. And so we'd like to have people like your dean, certainly in our military, and so maybe we can clone you. So today, the title of my talk sounds like a Woody Allen movie, What Keeps Me Awake at Night. And I'll talk about that, sort of complain about my insomnia in various forms today. But first of all, just so everyone knows what country we're talking about, it's a small country. And first of all, the first slide will show where we are in Europe. Sorry. That's the wrong slide. Let me have the next slide, please. Oops, there's another wrong slide. That's the right slide. See where that little thing over here? That's us. As you can see, we're not very big, but because of the projection, it actually looks smaller than it is. Because in fact, Denmark is actually smaller than we are. The Netherlands are smaller than we are. So, but on the other hand, and when it comes to population, we're the real losers. So we're very small. Anyway, we're basically the size of the Netherlands. Locally here, you take Vermont and New Hampshire together, you get basically what we are. But on the other hand, Europe is rather small compared to the United States. But on the other hand, what we have done since we restored our independence, that it was taken away by the Soviet Union, and then we finally got it back. We were in a fairly dire straits. I mean, 50 years of Soviet occupation did a lot of damage, and perhaps the opportunity cost of all the things we didn't do during those 50 years were even worse because we just didn't develop very much as a country. And so our solution to getting out of that backwardness, especially faced with, say, 50 years of falling behind, was to concentrate on the one area where we were on a level playing field. You recall, 92, 93, Mosaic was the first web browser. In 92, we had our first full year of independence, and a bunch of us thought that, if there's no other way of getting ahead, it'll take us, building highways and bridges takes a long time, but we could sort of leap aboard the then slowly beginning train, which is the IT revolution, that we could do something. And IT is, I guess, like the Colt 45, the great equalizer, because a poor, small country, in fact, can be, by being very clever, do a lot and change and have a completely different position in the world than you would expect from looking at the map and looking at the population, looking at the GDP per capita. And in fact, I would say that what we are in the middle of today is something even more rapid than industrialization in the late 18th, early 19th centuries, where the world is undergoing a complete change in the way things are done. I would argue it's a paradigmatic transformation of our world, where the notions of a nation's size, wealth, power, military might, population numbers, GDP relations, all mean something very different. It's kind of like if you read The Economist, they have these tag balloons, and where they have what's trending, and then as soon as you click on it, you see all these things getting bigger and smaller. It's all in a state of flux, as in the news, so too with countries. And so what we have today is that what was a small, backward, poor East European country in 1991 today is a leader in cyber and in e-governance especially, while some rich and large countries are stuck in the technology of the 20th century. So, I mean, I won't go into all the wonderful things we've done in e-governance because then I would be here for another hour. But I would say, to horribly mix metaphors, Estonia has, because of its cyber, become a proverbial canary in a minefield, where in cybersecurity we have faced threats and faced down threats that really do expose the kinds of vulnerabilities that all of our societies will face as they become more computerized and connected. I mean, in our case, we are the canary because, in fact, we are so reliant on IT. 98% of bank transactions are done online. 98% of income tax returns are done online, and this ever since about the year 2000. 95% of prescriptions are filled online. That means if you go to a doctor, he just puts it into the computer, and you can go to any pharmacy in Estonia and take out your prescriptions. Actually, it's eminently reasonable, but for some reason, the rest of the world still deals with paper prescriptions with a doctor's scrawl. The last elections, we had 25% of people voting online. The entire country is covered by Wi-Fi. But then you get to this crucial paradox, which I read about as a child regarding nuclear weapons, which is that the more sophisticated you are, the more vulnerable you are. Back then, I read about how, well, if there were a nuclear war, the only ones who would survive are the cockroaches. Today, in the world of cyber attacks, the less computerized you are, the less likely you are to be affected. I mean, there are many, many countries in the world that if they were to suffer a cyber attack, no one would ever notice. On the other hand, if you become highly sophisticated in this area, then it becomes problematic. We sort of reached the sort of crossed the threshold of breaking news back in April, May of 2007 when we were deluged by a nationwide series of attacks, which are called DDoS attacks, and I'll just take a moment out to explain what it is. Basically, I would say it's a virtual cyber siege. All computer systems rely on servers, and these servers route all the messages where they have to go. But you can overload these things, and you overload them by just putting massive numbers of signals into them. How do you do that? Well, you all get these funny spam mails. I mean, by the hundreds. Why do you get spam? Well, you get spam because millions, some estimate up to 30% of computers and the personal computers in the world have been taken over by criminal gangs. A computer that is taken over by a criminal gang, I mean, you never know. It's just that when you're not using your computer, it's sending all kinds of messages out, Viagra ads, maybe even to yourself. But anyway, it's under someone else's control, and it is a robot. It comes from, that's shortened to bot. These are bots. Now, for a bot alone, a single computer is not much, but so they're all interconnected, and you have hundreds, thousands, tens of thousands of computers that have been taken over, and each one has a bot. You put them all together, you get a botnet. And so the thing here, you have these botnets, which basically spend most of their time sending you spam. But these are all illegal. They're run and owned by criminal gangs, mainly from the former Soviet Union, unfortunately. And what you can do is you can rent time on them. You can rent time to send out Viagra ads, or you can rent time to send signals to a single place or several places. And so if you have hundreds of thousands of computers, which are all controlled and which are rentable and are rented out, you can just pinpoint and target servers. So you can, government sites, newspapers, banks, in our case, all of those, plus even the European equivalent of 911. I mean, the emergency phone number, 911, in Europe is 112. All of those can be shut down. And that's what happened to us. It's very primitive, but it's how we got onto the cybersecurity map. It's one of the problems of cybersecurity is you don't know who does it, who's doing it, but if you remember your David Hume, you'll know that in an essay on human understanding, you know that two events that are in close temporal proximity usually are a pretty good guide to causality. And things are close together, you think they run together, and at the time, what was causing a big political brouhaha in my country was that there was a Soviet statue in the middle of town that was causing all kinds of problems with the people congregating around it and doing all kinds of nasty things that we decided to move it. And because we moved it then the Russian government got very annoyed. And now whether there is a connection between that and the cyber attacks, who knows? But I bet the cyber attacks did not come from Uruguay. So, but what we did, and here the Admiral would appreciate this, I mean, basically, this was policy carried out by other means. Who said that? Right, well, you know that, but okay, yes. Von Clausewitz's definition of war is policy carried out by other means. And so that's what happened with banks, government services, and all the other things, emergency response numbers shut down. So, I mean, we were the first victims of anyone ever using cyber as a continuation of policy by other means, or you could say the first case of aggression. Now, as I said, one of the problems we will face more and more is attribution. This will become a very serious problem when we get to more dangerous forms of cyber warfare. But it does differ from all previous forms of warfare in that as long as you have rocks, people throwing rocks, or shooting arrows, spears, bullets, mortars, bombs, missiles, which is now redefined as kinetic warfare, because before it was just warfare. Now it's kinetic because you also have digital, and suddenly you have to find a word for it, and so rocks move and rockets move, so it's kinetic. These, you know where the rocks come from, or when someone throws a rock at you, you can see on the radar where the missile comes from. Under cyber attack, you don't know where it's come from. You don't know who's done it. As I mentioned, you may not even know that it's being done. Okay, I'm not going to really focus too much on this, in many ways, on what happened in Estonia 6 years ago, because I would argue we have moved light years beyond that. There was an interesting episode, which those of you who are really interested in all this, is chronicled in 2 articles in the January 2011 issue of Small Wars Journal, that when we got to the Georgian War, this had become a little more advanced. It's kind of like the Colin Powell doctrine. You soften up with air power, then you go in with the soldiers. Well, what they did was that before bombing or rocketing or mortaring certain places in Georgia, the Russians would stage a computer attack on the servers in the area, blanking out the area, creating the Clausewitzian fog of war. No one knew what was going on. Communications were out. And then they would launch the kinetic attack. This was kind of applying the Powell doctrine to cyber. But things have moved very far beyond that. Not that sort of DDoS attacks, as I mentioned, that happened to us, are that have gone away. But now we have Stuxnet, we have Dooku. Today, in warfare, I mean, you don't have to attack a country with an army. You can wipe out the country's financial records. You can wipe out all of the records in banks. And what do you do then? I mean, the country is suddenly broke. On a more subtle level, you can steal their intellectual property. But when we think about it, all of this can, in fact, be, well, I mean, it renders traditional warfare, it can render traditional warfare irrelevant. Because when you think about warfare, the idea is you have a war to take over or at least control a territory. That, ever since the days of rocks and caves, was something that you would fight against using the same means, rocks or whatever, missiles, anyway, kinetically. Now, when it comes to this, you can in fact bypass the defenses or even the offensive capability of any adversary you have. Because, in fact, you can just shut the country down. If you really want, it is possible to do so. And at that point, especially because if you don't have the forensics to figure out who did it, you don't need, I mean, there's no point in launching an attack. I mean, you can have an idea who did it, but what happens if you have a false flag thing? What happens if your country is suddenly immobilized and they leave enough clues that the Chinese did it when, in fact, the Russians did it, or vice versa? Do you launch an attack? No, you don't want to launch an attack because you don't know. You don't want to start World War III and by hitting the wrong guy. I mean, I don't know if you want to start World War III anyway, but at least you want to get the right guy if you're going to go that far. And so this is, we are in a new era, and this is one reason why, one of the reasons that I will describe here, why I do lose sleep at night, because in fact, we are vulnerable in my country. You are vulnerable in the United States. There are a whole bunch of countries which perhaps are a little less vulnerable for the reasons I explained, that they are not so reliant upon IT technology. But basically, any country that is a modern, well-functioning society is so dependent upon the use of modern technology that they will, in fact, be vulnerable. And actually the vulnerabilities that we now face come from an altogether different area than having your servers knocked out. But it's that in the past 20 years, our societies, though we do not often realize it, have become completely dependent upon the functioning of well, so basically feedback networks that are run over the internet. To be more precisely, the term is SCADA, S-C-A-D-A. It stands for Supervisory Control and Data Acquisition Systems. These systems, be it on-time delivery of milk to your grocery store. Those of you who have thinning hair like me or graying hair, remember that in supermarkets in the United States 30, 40 years ago, there'd be guys or girls with clipboards writing down how many cans of peas you need to order for next week to keep the inventory stocked. That doesn't happen anywhere anymore, at least not in modern societies, because it's all done via SCADA system that just notes that, well, it looks like we're running low on cans of peas this week. So, and it orders them automatically. All power plants in a modern era are run on SCADA systems. Traffic control systems are run by SCADA systems, your traffic lights. Last year, there was a strike by the people who control the traffic systems in Los Angeles, and one of them had unfortunately, the very dumb idea of actually manipulating the traffic lights. And they caught him, and he's probably in jail by now, or if he's in trial. But the point is, if you want to paralyze a town, paralyze a city, you just by manipulating the SCADA system, you can shut it down by turning all the lights red. If you want to be really nasty, you turn all the lights green. All right? I mean, everyone then drives through the intersection, and then you have a real mess on your hand. So basically, we have arrived at a situation where you can shut all of the vital, critical infrastructure of a country down, and the reason you can do it is because there no longer is such a thing as critical infrastructure, the term that's been used for years and years. Anything that in a modern society is critical infrastructure today is actually critical information infrastructure. And so you must deal with the vulnerabilities that you face when you have this kind of situation in which, with relative impunity, someone can shut these systems down. You need to harden your systems. That is the big task that we are faced with, and at the same time, it requires us to rethink a lot about the military, because you may have an F-35 fighter, the most modern, best fighter in the world, but if the lights don't work, it's not going to be much use. A battle carrier group perhaps can function on its own, though there have been attempts to get at them as well. But if the country it's on the high seas, but if what's happened in the country itself is total paralysis, that's not going to do much good either. I mean, so we have to rethink basically all of our doctrines on defense because of the vulnerabilities we now have. Slowly, governments around the globe are waking up to this. to these things. Of course, on the other hand, you can say the bad guys have also woken up to the possibilities of cyber. Certainly, we see this all the time with the use of by authoritarian and totalitarian governments to restrict information coming into their countries, to follow people, to track them, to arrest them. With all of the sort of happy news about the internet, Twitter, Facebook liberating people, you also have to figure out that there are a lot of bad regimes that are no less capable technologically than Zuckerberg, and they're doing other things with these things. I won't get into it at length, but basically I would anyone worried about these things should read Yevgeny Morozov's book, The Net Delusion, The Dark Side of Internet Freedom, which is really a fantastic overview, even though it's only 3 years old already, but on how authoritarian governments have harnessed the internet and technology to harass, infiltrate, and arrest those who expose corruption. Recently, a couple of bloggers in Russia were put in jail because they, in fact, posted pictures of government officials whose palaces, I should say, genuine palaces, would make the Versailles pale in comparison, but with their official salaries, they couldn't even afford, a lawn ornament on these things. So we're in this new era where we are vulnerable, where IT is used by other countries, in fact, to torment, to harass, and to also isolate their own citizens. And this is, I think, is going to require a lot of thinking in the future on our part on how we proceed, because it undermines the nature of the fundamental assumptions we've had up till now. Especially, I think we're stuck where we have to deal with a triangle of issues and how to square the triangle, as it were. We have security, which is a major problem, security of our SCADA systems, of all of our electronic systems. We have the issue of privacy, which, because of the NSA revelations now, is really at the forefront of discussions. And the balance between security and privacy is really finding the place in between. Those two is really the debate that's going on. But on top of that, there is the issue of freedom as well. Internet freedom, the right and ability to say what you want. Trying to find something in between that is hard. We, on the other hand, I'll start by saying, I should congratulate the United States for being number 2 in the world in internet freedom. So, as the number 1 country, we have, and we actually have very much in common with the United States, and we have been working very closely together because there are major attempts going on all the time, especially last fall with something called the International Telecommunications Union, which was trying to impose rules and regulations on the internet. Basically, it was the authoritarian countries decided that they'd had enough of this free internet, and basically China, Iran, Russia, Belarus, all these countries decided that this kind of internet is not tolerable. We have to impose our own will on this. And we in the United States, along with Germany, which is number 3 in internet freedom, and then sort of countries down the line up to number 16, I'd say, were the ones who were at the forefront of actually maintaining a free internet with open stakeholders, international stakeholders, and not to impose what I would call the Westphalianization of the internet. All of you know this, of course, because the Peace of Westphalia, the nation state, the idea of cuius regio, eius religio, that whoever's the ruler, that's the religion. The idea then would be, if you're the rulers of a totalitarian government, you would impose your ideology onto the internet, and of course it would go beyond your borders because the internet's borderless. And that is going to be another big battle. Unfortunately, thanks to at least some of the allegations that have come out since Snowden, this has given a new thrust to the attempts of authoritarian governments to limit the freedom on the internet. But ultimately, when it comes to all of this, again, for all you Fletcher people, we are in the middle of the Thucydidean dilemma of Melos, if you recall the Melian dialogues. Strong do what they will, and the weak do what they must. Now we're not strong enough in Estonia to actually sort of go against the big ones. That's why we like to work with the United States. But this is where we do need international norms, standards, agreements on how to proceed in this new world. So, I mean, my call would be basically every political science, every IR course, every IR school, every diplomatic school needs to deal with this change in the world because it affects, hard security, soft security, diplomatic relations. It's all in there. International law. I do hope your library has the Tallinn Manual, which is the one and only book on the role of international law on conflict in cyberspace. It was done by the NATO Center of Excellence located in Tallinn, Estonia, but it's an international effort put out by Oxford University Press. It is the only book that actually looks at, is the only compendium of international law as it applies to the cyber world. Now, we could, of course, solve all of this in one very simple way, which is we go back to 1989, say. No iPads, no smartphones, in fact, no mobile phones, no personal computers, or at least, you have something called, I think BitNet was something that was an academic thing that existed before. No web browsers. I mean, that only came in 92, 93 with Mosaic. So we can go back to that, and then we're okay. It's like one U.S. representative from Congress who actually dealt with cyber issues who told me that she's buried $60,000 in coffee cans around her house because if she ever goes off, I mean, if the grid ever goes, she's at least got money, and she also told me how many rifles she has. Now, well, that's one way of dealing with it, but I really don't think society will ever go back to that. Unless you have really successful cyber attacks all over the world, then we may be forced to go back to that, an electromagnetic pulse may wipe out everything, and then all your iPads, iPhones, and iMacs are all sort of turned into dead technology. But, assuming that is not going to happen, then we have to refocus our attention a lot on the security issues connected to cyber and our dependence upon cyber, and especially our dependence upon supervisory control and data acquisition, or SCADA systems, because that's what we all run on today, or at least we all depend on that. So that's really where I would say where the threats come in. One area that, of course, that we should be doing something, I mentioned in this book, is that we need to work on international agreements on this. Here again, there's only one right now that actually exists that is in any way functional, but it's also illustrative of the problem. There's a body called the Council of Europe, which is not the same thing as the European Union. It has about 36, 38 members of countries that are in Europe. It used to have a requirement that you had to be a democratic country to join. They eased up on that in a period of Russophilia in the early 90s. But anyway, there is a convention on cybercrime. It's so good a convention that after the Council of Europe and most of the members of the Council of Europe signed up to it, that the United States, Canada, Japan, Philippines, South Korea, a whole bunch of countries have acceded to this. And basically the premise of this is that a country that has acceded to this is obligated to cooperate on an investigation of cybercrime. The problem with, as with all agreements, as we know also from the fact that Syria is not party to the CBW Convention, is that Russia, China, Belarus have not acceded to this treaty. So that if there is a cyber attack or if there's cyber crime, they are under no obligation to, in fact, cooperate with any of this stuff. And between that and the ITU, there is a serious danger that we may end up with at least a two-tier internet, where there's the internet of free countries, and then there's the internet of not-so-free countries. There's an internet that is relatively safe, where you know that there's some kind of rule of law that is there, and then there are those countries for which that does not apply. Again, this is a whole brave new world that we're moving into. Now, we could always say, what about NATO? I mean, where's NATO in all this? And we do have one institution, the Center for Excellence, NATO Center of Excellence for Cybersecurity, based in Estonia. But unfortunately, I would say the problem in NATO today is that cybersecurity is mostly remains in the paradigm of intelligence gathering and espionage. That is to say, you don't share anything. NATO otherwise is based on interoperability. I mean, even in the worst of times, you could take in terms of transatlantic relations, you could take an American Tomahawk and put it under a French Mirage, or I'm not sure I get the right missile, but anyway, that you just, they click, literally, they fit under there, so if you have a Mirage and you want to fire an American missile, you just do it. That's interoperability. When it comes to cyber, we don't have that. It's like the old spy world. You sit there and you don't show your cards to anyone. Now, as long as you have this sort of intelligence gathering and sort of holding your cards close to the chest mentality when it comes to cyber, we're not going to go very far. And that's the problem in NATO today, is that we have interoperable rockets, but we don't have interoperable intelligence and systems dealing with cyber attacks. So this requires, I would argue, a far higher level of ambition in NATO to move beyond where we are today. And here, aside from Estonia, I don't know there are many countries that are really committed to the idea of interoperability. We need people to move to a need to share mindset. And we also need to get countries to do their homework more, because if you don't do your homework, then you'll be in trouble. One of the problems related to all of this is that there's a big divide between the U.S. and Europe, except for sort of some of the countries in Northern Europe, is that here at least you have politicians who get cyber, who get computers, who understand what I talk about when I talk here, which is one reason I like to talk in the United States, because people understand what I'm talking about. Whereas in Europe, there are very many countries where at the top level of political leadership, they don't have a clue, and literally do not have a clue. They don't have a clue because they've grown up without ever, as if the last 20 years didn't exist. One example, I won't mention the country because it would be extremely embarrassing, because it's a very big and important country in Europe, but basically their top political leadership the administration was subject to a spear phishing attack. It's very easy to do, actually. You just look on the web page, and there you find there's a person who works in the office, and then you look on the home page. You look at their Facebook page, and you find out their cousin has recently had a kid, and then you just make a fake mail. The fake mail says pictures of Junior, and the person says, of course, this is from my cousin, and now I get to see the picture of my second cousin. He clicks on it, and you actually get a picture, but unfortunately at the same time, a keystroke logger, that is something that passes on every little keystroke you make, gets sent to either one country, another country, or a third country. And so in a matter of days, because of this, it gets spread to the next person and the next person. The entire administration has been compromised, and every mail goes out. And so I said, you mean the president too? And they said, no, the president didn't get it. I said, wow, he must have pretty good security. No, He doesn't use a computer. He's never used a computer. He never will. So, and I should say the president at the time was younger than I am. So it's so let me just say a few words about NSA and the Snowden affair. I would argue that the answer to dealing with these issues cannot lie in drafting highly restrictive legislation that in fact plays into the hands of the not so nice people, the people those people I would call our enemies, who have a fundamentally different value system, no regard for human dignity and freedom of speech. Now, it is a little worrisome when you see that the sales of Orwell's 1984, after the allegations came to light, increased 600-fold. I don't think that we are dealing, in fact, with an Orwellian situation, but certainly there is a lot of negative reaction to this in the United States. And in the United States, you have certain constitutional safeguards. Those safeguards do not extend to me, for example. So, I mean, the President of the United States can say, you don't have to worry, you have your constitutional guarantees. And that's true if you're a U.S. citizen. Now, if you're an Estonian citizen, well, you don't have those guarantees. So that has led, I mean, one of the results of this is this wave of anti-Americanism, which, again, is not very healthy. And we are sort of concerned about that because it's become very popular. Basically, I listened to the Brazilian president the other day going on and on about how bad the United States is. It's as if, the other guys are really good. I mean, this is a bizarre thing happening in people's minds. In Russia, all internet service providers have to go directly through the FSB. I mean, it's not as if they're snooping on you. They just go, I mean, it's like they're there. I mean, goes in and then it comes out of the other side of the FSB. So, but anyway, so when I say that we have to triangulate these issues of security, privacy, and the free flow of information, we're going to, I would argue, spend a lot of intellectual effort on these issues. But it is something we must do. Now, that's what keeps me up some of the time, and if I fall asleep by reading my memos from my staff, then I always have something else to do to keep me up, and that's the state of transatlantic relations. I mean, these are related issues, as I mentioned. But we in Estonia are part of what Don Rumsfeld called New Europe. That is. By which he meant the countries that did not hate the United States and that did commit to Iraq and did commit without caveats to Afghanistan. There are other terms and appellations. Jacques Chirac said that we were badly brought up children who did not know when to shut up. But I mean, the problem, both of them actually touch upon something which is real. I mean, people in Central and Eastern Europe who lived under 50 years of communism kind of appreciate freedom perhaps more than some other people. When it came to us, the principal position in the United States for 50 years of not recognizing the occupation of our country meant something to the people. To be more blunt, since I used to work there, there was a station called Radio Free Europe that everyone really depended upon in Eastern Europe. There was no European Radio Free Europe. I mean, it was an American congressionally funded operation. And so this is one reason why I would argue the people in Eastern Europe do count on the United States, are more transatlantic, value that relationship far more than some of the other countries that think they can do it on their own, but I don't think anyone can. And so as the response on our part, not just my country, but is that we do our bit, we do our share. We do go into tough areas when there is a NATO operation. We don't say no. We don't. Our rules of engagement are that we only shoot if they shoot at us. That's not exactly a way how to run a war. Now, here today, what I see is a change, and the change is on both sides of the Atlantic. I can see that, Syria is a perfect example of this. you read all these commentaries. I'm not going to say my personal opinion on all this, but certainly you read all the commentaries. The U.S. didn't do that. U.S. should do that. Well, there's a little missing element here. Where do you see the word Europe? I mean, where do you see the discussion of what should Europe do? No discussion. It's all the U.S. is good, the U.S. is bad, the U.S. is not doing enough, the U.S. is doing too much. But, I mean, here we are. We're in Europe. We're right next to Syria, right? I mean, in fact, and there's a NATO member known as Turkey, which shares a, 800-kilometer border with Syria. And so we're not exactly, doing our share sort of in general in our mindset. More importantly, Europe's strategic willingness and capability to project power and fulfill its share of the transatlantic burden is a real serious concern. 2 years and years we've been talking about we got to do our own thing. Unfortunately, the paradigm for this is the famous foreign minister of that big military power, Luxembourg, Jacques Pause, who said in 1993, when right before Srebrenica, that this is Europe's hour. This is we are going to solve this. And, how did Bosnia get solved? Finally, the United States came in and they just bombed the hell out of the Serbs and basically said, okay, now we have peace. Europe did not do very much there, even though it is Europe's backyard. At the same time, Europe is not only not doing, but they're also not paying, which is a particular sort of bête noire of mine. 2 years ago, the outgoing Secretary of Defense, Bob Gates, gave a warning speech. It was his valedictory speech to the NATO allies in Brussels. And he said that American preparedness to turn a blind eye to the continual free rider problem is not going to last for long. Right now, NATO comprises basically 900 million people. I mean, that's the full, take all the NATO countries, put them together, all sharing Article 5, commitments to defense. 900 million people, U.S., Canada, Turkey, everyone. 75% of the NATO budget is paid by the United States. So in other words, basically 300 million people are paying 75% of the NATO budget. Only a few European countries actually, there's a goal, suggested goal, basically an agreed upon goal, that every country contributes 2% of its GDP to defense. Today, there are 4 countries in Europe that do that. 6 that come close, but basically 4 countries meet the obligation that we took in signing up to NATO. We're one of them, by the way. And there's Greece, and then there's the UK, and then there's Bulgaria, and I don't know where France is. Well, right now it's not there anymore. Okay, that's it. Poland's close. It's 1.95. So it's kind of within the margin of error, so we can count the Poles as well. But that's it, and everyone else is way down there and not doing their share. And this is not sustainable politically. It's not possible to continue thinking that we don't have to invest in defense. The United States is going to help us anyway, and on top of that, you have to go through your ritual and de rigueur American bashing. It will not last, especially if you see the change in American thinking, which I see is becoming more and more isolationist, or at least unwilling to actually get involved in foreign entanglements, to use George Washington's terminology. So I think we have to start worrying somewhat in Europe. But I think the Americans, you guys, shouldn't really abandon us immediately, because on the other hand, we're the only part of the world that really fundamentally agrees with you on the core issues. When it comes to, well, no, seriously, freedom of speech, fundamental rights and freedoms, democracy, rule of law. where else are you going to get that? I mean, there are nice individual countries here and there. You know, Samuel Huntington wanted to include Japan in the European civilization because they have rule of law, democracy, and fundamental freedoms. I mean, there are countries here and there, but basically the one area in the world where you can basically say everyone here believes in the same stuff we do. You know, we're not into kleptocracy. We're not into jailing people for saying what they believe. I mean, that's us. And so it's also in the United States' interest, of course, not to disengage from Europe. And, of course, even militarily, despite the low expenditures on defense on the part of the European countries by and large, we're with you on these. We understand these things. And as Admiral Stavridis' successor, as SACEUR, General Breedlove, just said very recently, Europe remains the ally of choice, or the allies of choice for the United States. So this is a dilemma that we face, and what I worry about and why I get angry at some of my colleagues from other European countries is that they're not doing their share. And by not doing their share, by contributing too little, either in the way of defense expenditures or in terms of boots on the ground in NATO operations, they are in fact weakening the transatlantic link and the ones who are actually making it easier for the United States to disengage from our side of the world. And then, as I said, there is a certain growing isolationism here. There is a war weariness that's very much to be felt in the United States, including among the senior officers. You probably have seen more of that than we have, but because they put on a good face to us, but you talk to them. Both the left and the right today, from the Tea Party to the Occupy Wall Street movements, are very isolationist. And the isolationism, I think, is something that has got us into trouble many times in the past. So, well, let me wrap up and answer some questions because I have talked for a long time. Basically, I won't go into the subject of the pivot, which is the term given to greater attention paid to Asia than to Europe. From my point of view, it's completely understandable. I mean, that's where the issues are over there. But on the other hand, we Europeans are making it much easier for the United States to pivot by giving plenty of excuses to say they're not doing their share. Last April, this April, Stars and Stripes had an article. Last U.S. tank leaves Europe. I mean, I'm sure a few stuck around somewhere, but as monuments or something. But nonetheless, there are no more U.S. tanks in Europe. Now, given that, the whole Cold War period, if you know your Cold War history, filled a gap. I mean, the whole idea was, hundreds of thousands of tanks are going to pour into Europe across the Central European plain. Now there's not a single U.S. tank anymore in Europe defending Europe. We have not entered, unfortunately, looking at the world today, Immanuel Kant's period of perpetual peace. Sorry, it's not there. We would like it to be there, and a lot of the European rhetoric is that we have banished war forever from Europe. Well, we probably have banished sort of the Germans invading the French and vice versa, or the French invading the Brits, or the Spanish invading. That's not going to happen. On the other hand, we have a pretty nasty neighborhood, and that, well, we do. I mean, so they can do all kinds of things to us, and right now, we look at our big neighbor to the east. We have been, along with, I guess, all of you guys, sort of hoping for 20 years that we will see a normal, civilized, democratic country that respects human rights on our borders. This is the standard stuff we heard 20 years ago. Democratic countries don't invade each other. They'd rather have McDonald's. Well, in fact, you could have McDonald's and still be an authoritarian, xenophobic country and not have democracy, which then has a chip on its shoulder and is increasingly wants to challenge the international status quo and test the limits of Western cohesion and rhetoric. I mean, a case in point is that right now we have an ongoing military exercise on our border, which basically, while they said it's only 13,000 troops because that's the limit allowed by the Vienna Convention not to have observers, but in fact, as it turns out, is somewhere between 52 and 60,000 troops. And while it's supposed to be defensive, everything we can see or we can listen to says it is strictly offensive, and it's basically a battle plan to invade Northern Europe. This is a kind of, we have to deal with this reality. We don't quite understand why a country whose southern underbelly is really the big problem for security, but for psychological reasons, presumably, or for whatever, I don't know the mind of those people, but they seem to think that let's practice invading the countries in our west who belong to NATO. So, So between the cyber and between these military exercises and between all the other stuff with the U.S. disengaging and pivoting and rebalancing and us being anti-American or whatever your opinions are, all that keeps me awake, and that's why I take my melatonin. Thank you.
Fabulous. Wow. A terrific talk, Mr. President. You took us from George Washington and entangling alliances to George Orwell and Brave New World. We saw the technology run from coffee cans full of dollars buried in the ground to the Internet of Machines. You've given an extraordinary display tonight, and above all, you've been incredibly candid and honest, and we appreciate it. So with that, let me open it up to some questions, please. We'll take 2 or 3 before we have to break. Yes, sir, up here.
Why do you think that there are only 4 countries in Europe that spend less than 2%, spend around 2% or more of the GDP on stuff that you mentioned, on war, stuff like that? What do you think is the reason behind that?
Why do I think that only 4 do, or why don't the rest?
Why don't the rest?
Because you don't have to, because there are no repercussions. The United States does not say to Estonia, you're good, and doesn't say to the countries that, I won't mention them, but anyway, 0. You can look all these up, but 0.7, 0.9, it doesn't say, well, as a result, you don't do your share, we're really not going to put a base on your territory. If you don't have a little carrot and a big stick, or the other way around, it's not going to work. You need to be consistent, or in German you'd say konsequent. If you do A, you get B. If you don't do A, you don't get B. And that I think, the U.S. I think should speak more firmly on these issues. We're happy to chime in, in harmony. But we're the singing revolution people. But anyway, so that I think is the reason, because you can get away with not doing it. If you can get away with not paying your taxes, would you pay your taxes? Right?
You don't have to answer that question. Yes, sir.
Wait a minute. My name is Dan. I'm a second-year student here at Fletcher. Thank you for
talking to this.
Thank you for coming. My question is regarding public-private partnerships and what you deemed as information critical infrastructure. What lessons have you learned that the U.S. can adopt, because U.S. critical infrastructure is not really protected by any federal agency, or not completely? So what kind of advice would you provide to the U.S., to DHS, or to the NSA in order to provide a more robust cooperation effort? Thank you.
Okay, I skipped the entire private-public part of my talk just in the interest of time. But before we get to that part, let me just say that what's happening in the world today is the bad guys have very robust public-private partnership. When we had our cyber attacks, I went to our CERT, which is the Computer Emergency Response Team. Every country has one. You have a big one. We have one too. And we looked at the cyber attacks. Now, you would think you would see a normal Gaussian distribution of sort of cyber attacks slowly increasing, reaching a peak and coming down. It was completely discrete. At 0000 GMT, there was a huge spike, and then it continued till 24:00:00 at this 24 hours GMT. And I said, well, that's not possible. How did that happen? And then the guy who's our sort of geek in chief said, the money ran out. And I said, what do you mean the money ran out? Well, this was purchase time. If you read this wonderful book by a British journalist named Misha Glenny, called Dark Market, which is about the theft, the rings that steal credit cards. He brings out there's an agreement signed by the biggest credit card theft ring located in Ukraine. And it's a three-part agreement, and it's with the FSB, the internal secret police of Russia, which shouldn't even be operating outside the borders of Russia, but it's in Ukraine. And it said basically the ring agreed it would never steal any credit card numbers from the CIS, the Commonwealth of Independent States, in no country in that area. In return, the FSB, the Russian secret police, would never cooperate with any Western police groups that wanted that information or information on it. And of course, they're not part of the Budapest Convention. And then the third part was, if ever needed, this criminal gang would, in fact, render services to the FSB. So that's a real public-private partnership of the kind, and there's a lot of this. If you read the Mondiant report from this year's, from spring sometime, I'm looking what the number is anyway, there is a base, there is a military base near Shanghai. Yes, it's the PLA Army Unit 61398. And if you look at the Mondiant report that came out then, they'll talk about this group 61398. And for some reason, all of the hacking, or a large part of the hacking that comes that attacks certain things, comes from computers that are all based around this base in Shanghai. They're all students. I mean, they're computer science students. So what the deniability is that we don't know anything. We don't know about these hackers working on this thing. It's just how happens that they all live right next door to the unit that's in charge of hacking all this stuff. Now, we can't have proof, but this sounds like another public-private partnership, or maybe it's a scholarship program. I don't know. But in any case, so that's their side. Now, the other side is much worse. I mean, we're in a much worse situation, and this is, again, a fundamental issue that strikes at the core of Western liberal democracy, because non-kleptocratic, democratic countries, rule of law countries, have built over the centuries a firewall. That's what liberal democracy is about, is that there's the private sector and then there's the public sector, and unlike some of these, my favorite countries to our east, the minister of telecommunications does not also own the largest telecom in the country. That's true in a lot of countries, by the way. They do own. And so this firewall prevents cooperation because you don't want to give anyone a break. Under liberal democracy, in capitalism, little democracy, everyone's supposed to play on a level playing field. So how do you get the cooperation when, in fact, the biggest attacks, in fact, are on our private corporations? For years and years, I talked about, there's a thing called the Munich Security Conference where everyone talks about security, and no one ever wanted to talk about cybersecurity. And then 2 years ago, all of a sudden, Cameron comes in and devotes half a speech to cybersecurity. Haig comes in and spends his entire speech talking about cybersecurity. And then my old friend who was head of GCHQ, which is the sort of the British NSA, I asked her, so what's this? Why are you've been brushing us off for all these years, saying this is not relevant. Now you're you're devoting all this time to this issue. And what she said was that we suddenly realized how much money we're losing, and that we are being bankrupted through intellectual property theft. Last year, Sean Henry, who is now retired from the FBI, was number 2, actually, at a hearing in front of the Senate, gave an example of a U.S. company that had spent $1 billion in 10 years of research on some product. Sounds like a drug company to me by the amount of money and the amount of time. And that all their research was sucked out in a weekend. They just came in and, sort of, and, Ross Perot couldn't imagine anything like that. Of course, you're too young to remember Ross Perot, but anyway. He talked about the great sucking sound. And so this is where we need much closer cooperation, but we need new rules, because the rules can't be that one company gets the contract or one company gets it and the other company doesn't get it. And that's where it becomes very difficult in democracy. You have here in the United States, people who do procurement and then go to work for the company that got the contract go to jail. In Germany, Gerhard Schröder just gets $40 million for the Nord Stream pipeline, but in the United States, you go to jail. In my country, you go to jail too. And so we need a lot of intellectual work on this. I mean, I can identify the problem. I don't know what the answer is, but certainly legally, we have to do a lot of work on how we're going to proceed, because the firewall we have between the private and the public sector is very high. It's worked very well until now. But when private companies become a primary target of basically of war, I mean, we're going back, in one way of putting it, we're going back to the Barbary pirates. From the halls of Montezuma to the shores of Tripoli, right? We will fight our nation. Okay. The Barbary pirates were in Tripoli, and they were, they went and they were privateers. They raided American and British and French ships back then. The British and the French weren't willing to do much, but the Americans finally went and took over Tripoli. But they were all under the protection of the Sultan in Istanbul, because it was part of the Ottoman Empire. So the main thing was don't get caught, pay your taxes, but you can do whatever you want. That's what we're dealing with today, and maybe we have to send in the U.S. Marines to the shores of Tripoli, except we just did that. You did that.
We have time for 2 more quick questions. Yes, ma'am, right here. Wait, one microphone.
Okay.
Thank you for being here, Mr. President. I graduated from Fletcher in 2010, and I've just concluded cybersecurity studies at the Naval War College with Professor Michael Smith, who wrote the Tallinn Manual, and other faculty I know you've met with multiple times. I was just wondering if you could quickly touch upon why do you think actually Estonia was able to bounce back from the cyber attack in 2007 relatively quickly compared to other countries, and specifically, I think, and that's what we mostly talk about, because of the relationship your government organization and agency have built before, and the continuity and resiliency planning that was already in place, and how we can learn from that. Thank you.
Well, I would argue, there are a couple of things. One thing was that we, in fact, they came in April. We had scheduled for March 2007 the first ever online voting. When we did preceding that, we said, okay, it's going to be a matter of honor for all kinds of hackers to disrupt the first online election. And so we gamed attacks. We assumed that the fundamental, basically that there would be DDoS attacks that would overwhelm our servers and ruin the elections. And so having found that out, we then set up a number of relations with other certs, mirror sites. So when it came, it didn't come actually during the election. It came connected with something altogether different. So we were practiced. We knew who to call. Basically, that's why people do war games. We had sort of did it for the election. That helped. The other thing is that actually our system is extremely robust where it isn't dependent upon those kinds of servers. And so the real backbone of our country is a system which is highly secure because it's based on, since you graduated, I'll tell you, it's a two-factor PKI system distributed over through an enterprise service bus. If that means anything to anyone else, I don't know, but in any case, for me it does, which is that basically you can't break into the government system. It's almost virtually impossible to do it. And since everything is distributed in different servers, then it makes, if you ultimately even knock something out, the damage done to the country is very limited. This is the fact that we do have a distributed enterprise service bus was actually a solution we came up with. It was completely serendipitous. It's when we decided in the end of the 1990s that we wanted to have our cloud and a big server, and we realized we didn't have enough money to buy one, so we ended up doing an enterprise service bus connecting all the different servers, and then we suddenly discovered, wow, this is far more secure than if you have one big server. But those were the two things. The NATO center had not really been decided yet, and as I said, the kind of Luddite mentality that, oh, that's not really real, was only finally broken by having real attacks, and then they said, okay, we'll give you this thing. And so I find it analogous actually to Werner von Braun going to Adolf Hitler saying, we ought to do rockets, and he said, no, these are toys for little boys. Thank God for the Blitz. Thank God for UK that they, in fact, Adolf Hitler was so troglodyte and Luddite, because it would have been, if they developed the V2 rocket 3 years earlier, it would have been a real mess. Well, we had the same kind of problem, is that we are saying, this is a threat, this is a threat, this is a threat, and people say, nah. And then after it happened to us, then they changed their mind.
And we have time for one last question. Yes, sir. Senator?
I'm Robert Helbig, a student at this wonderful school here. I'm wondering, you as an Estonian with the nasty neighbors to the east, you probably have a very different perception of the mission of NATO than, say, Portugal. So I'm wondering, where do you think NATO is heading? Is it going to become an organization more focused on territorial defense, or to focus on more broader international security issues?
Well, I think we're moving in the right direction, which for me is returning to the core task. 3-4 years ago, talking about Article 5 was not really very popular in NATO. I think we've gotten back to talking about Article 5. The defense of the alliance, I think, is much more of an issue than it was before. This kind of idea of out of area or out of business, which we saw already in the 90s, it has receded considerably, because it looks like the out of area may be a mess, but our own territory is under greater threat. If you have the kinds of exercises that we see going on near us, that does focus the mind. Now, in the case of Portugal, they admittedly are not under direct, immediate attack, and but we've always said, it's very nice to not worry about these things if you're like out there, toward from your perspective, over there. It's all of the possible stuff that could happen to you is far away, but we're back to having such notions as a frontline state. Germany, as long as they had the DDR, was highly concerned about its neighborhood. Now that they have a buffer of Poland and Slovakia up by us, it's much easier to say, well, we don't really have to worry.
Mr. President, thank you so much for spending so much time with us. Join me in a round of applause for a terrific leader.
Thank you.